The table was already set when Victoria Hale arrived. Two chairs, a small vase of wildflowers that someone on the staff had placed there without knowing anything, and three people she'd trusted for years positioned at separate tables around the room, their phones tilted just enough to look casual. She didn't notice any of it. She was too busy trying to get through the door without the left wheel catching on the threshold the way it always did in older buildings. She made it. She always made it. That was the thing about Victoria. She made it through everything, and nobody ever saw how much it cost her. If you've ever felt like the world was designed to remind you of everything you can't do, stay with this story until the very end. Like this video and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cafe was called Birchwood. It sat on the corner of Halsted and Monroe, in the kind of Chicago neighborhood that had been gentrifying for 15 years without ever quite finishing the job. Exposed brick next to a boarded-up storefront, artisan cold brew 2 doors down from a laundromat that hadn't updated its machines since 1994. Birchwood itself was the type of place that tried hard to feel effortless. Reclaimed wood tables, Edison bulbs strung low over the bar, a chalkboard menu that changed every week, and a soundtrack that rotated between soft indie and things that might have been jazz if you squinted. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of afternoon where the light came in sideways and turned everything amber, and the air outside had gone sharp enough that people were walking fast with their chins tucked down. Victoria Hale arrived at 2:47 p.m., 13 minutes early, because she was always early. Old habit. Before the accident, she'd been early because she liked to control the room, to be the person already seated, already composed, already reading something on her phone when the other party walked in. After the accident, she'd learned to be early for a different reason entirely. She needed time. Time to assess the entrance. Time to find out whether there were steps, whether the bathroom was accessible, whether the table they'd been given could actually accommodate her chair, or whether she'd spend the entire meeting wedged at an angle while the other person pretended not to notice. She sat outside in her car for 4 minutes first, not because she was nervous, she told herself it wasn't nerves, but because she wanted one more minute of being just a woman in a car, anonymous, unread by anyone. Then she went in. The door was heavier than it looked and swung inward in a way that made it awkward. She'd learned the technique: get the chair close, reach up and pull, hold it with one hand while rolling forward with the other. Pray nobody was coming out at the same moment. A young woman with a green apron, one of the baristas, saw her from behind the counter and started moving, but Victoria had already cleared the threshold before the girl could reach her. "I've got it, thanks," Victoria said. She kept her voice pleasant. She'd had 3 years of practice keeping her voice pleasant. The girl smiled and retreated, and Victoria looked around the room. Birchwood was maybe 2/3 full, laptop people. A couple near the back who were clearly on a first date, and both performing more confidence than they felt. A table of women in their 50s who seemed to be celebrating something quiet. The afternoon crowd, unhurried, comfortable, not paying attention to much. Except, her eyes moved across the room the way they always did. Automatic. A leftover from the version of herself who'd spent a decade reading boardrooms. She clocked things. The man near the window who seemed to be studying his phone but whose eyes weren't tracking the screen. The two women at the bar whose conversation had gone quiet in a way that wasn't natural. The woman in the corner who was definitely not reading her book. Something registered in the back of Victoria's mind, something she couldn't quite name, but she was already moving toward the table they'd described, window seat, good light, supposedly charming, and she filed the feeling away. The table had 2 chairs. One was already pulled out, positioned at a slight angle that someone had arranged, deliberately or not, to indicate where a wheelchair might be parked. Victoria pulled up alongside the table and looked at the second chair. She thought about Renata Simmons, who had called her last week to arrange this. "He's lovely," Renata had said. "Genuinely lovely, Vic. He's a mechanic, not some finance guy before you say anything. He's real. He's got a daughter. He lost his wife a couple years ago. I really think you should meet him." Victoria had said no twice. Then she'd thought about the last 8 months, which had been the loneliest 8 months of an already quiet life, and she'd said yes. She ordered a water from the barista who brought over a menu and told her their specials, and she sat with her hands in her lap and waited. At 3:02, the door opened. Bossy. He was not what she'd expected. She hadn't known what she'd expected exactly. Renata's description of lovely and real could have meant anything, but she'd assembled some composite in her mind without meaning to. Slightly awkward, trying too hard, the specific energy of a man who'd been set up on a blind date and was performing confidence he didn't feel. Mason Brooks was none of that. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under a hanging light fixture near the entrance, which he did without breaking stride and without seeming to notice it. He had the kind of build that came from actual work rather than a gym. Broad through the shoulders, hands that were clean but calloused, a jawline that needed a shave. He was wearing dark jeans and a collared shirt in a blue that was either deliberately chosen or accidentally perfect, and he was carrying, in his left hand, a small bunch of daisies wrapped in brown paper, like something from a farmer's market. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the room. Victoria watched him scan. She watched his eyes move, not with the assessing calculation she'd just used, but with something simpler. He was looking for a woman he'd never met. He had a description. Dark hair, would be seated by the window. His gaze found her. And here was the thing that Victoria would turn over in her mind later, lying awake in the dark with the Chicago wind pushing at her windows. He didn't hesitate. There was no flicker of recalibration, no half-second of his face rearranging itself. He just looked at her the same way you look at a person you're glad to finally see. He walked over. "Victoria?" His voice was low, easy. The kind of voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who didn't raise it very often but had no trouble being heard. "That's me," she said. He held out the daisies. "These are for you. I know it's a little, I don't know. I almost got roses, and then I thought, nobody actually likes roses that much. They just feel obligated to like roses." Victoria took the flowers. They were slightly imperfect, one stem shorter than the others, the paper bag already damp from his hand. "You're right," she said. "Nobody actually likes roses." "I'm Mason." He pulled out the chair across from her. Not in a performative way, not with any ceremony. He just sat down. "I know," she said. "Renata told me your name." "Did she tell you anything else?" "That you were lovely and real." She said it with a dry flatness that was half irony, and he laughed, a real one, surprised out of him. "That's either very accurate or I've been sold wrong," he said. "I guess we'll find out." What happened over the next 40 minutes was something Victoria hadn't had in a long time. A conversation that didn't require her to perform anything. She was used to being two things simultaneously: Victoria Hale, the person, and Victoria Hale, the CEO, the public face, the woman in the wheelchair who ran a billion-dollar company and therefore had to be twice as composed and 3 times as precise as anyone around her, always. The performance was constant and mostly invisible, even to herself. She'd forgotten it was a performance. Mason didn't ask her what she did for work. He didn't avoid it either. The question just didn't come up in the first half hour because they were talking about other things, the way people do when a conversation is actually going somewhere. He told her about his daughter Lily, 8 years old, currently obsessed with building things. She made a birdhouse last month that was genuinely better than ones I've seen for sale. I'm not saying that just because she's mine. And about the auto shop he co-owned with a man named Dale, and about how he'd grown up in Evanston and moved back there after his wife died because his mother was there, and Lily needed consistency. Victoria told him about Chicago, about the neighborhood she'd grown up in, about a period in her late 20s when she'd been convinced she wanted to move to Portland, and how the fantasy had lasted exactly one visit in November, rain. She told him about the accident in the abstract, not the details, not what the car had looked like afterward, not the 6 weeks in the hospital, or the months of rehabilitation, or the specific medical language that had rearranged every plan she'd had for her life. Just, there was a car accident 3 years ago, and this is the result. She said it the way she always said it in early conversations, like reading from a card. Not because she was hiding, but because she'd learned that the more plainly she stated it, the less space it took up, and the less space it took up, the faster they could get back to talking to each other like people. Mason nodded. He said, "That must have required a hell of a lot of adjusting." Not, "I'm sorry," or "that must be so hard," or any of the things people said when they were performing sympathy. Just, "That must have required a hell of a lot of adjusting." "It did," Victoria said. "Are you still adjusting, or have you adjusted?" She looked at him. "Both, depending on the day." "Yeah," he said. "I know that feeling." She believed him. That was the thing. With Mason, she kept believing him. Chata. She had almost stopped noticing the phones. Almost. At some point, she couldn't say exactly when, maybe 20 minutes into the conversation, maybe 30, The thing in the back of her mind that she'd filed away when she'd first walked in reasserted itself. Not loudly, just a pressure, like a word you can't quite remember. She didn't let her eyes move, obviously. She was too experienced for that. But over the course of a few minutes, without appearing to shift her attention from Mason, she let her peripheral vision do its work. The man near the window, still there, his phone at the same angle. The two women at the bar, still there, still not really talking. The woman in the corner, whose book was closed now, and who was looking at her lap. And then she saw Renata. Renata Simmons was sitting in the far back corner of the cafe, half hidden by a column, but Victoria knew the way Renata held her shoulders, a specific tightness, a readiness. And she knew the orange of Renata's coat, and she knew, suddenly and completely, what this afternoon was. The heat that moved through her was not quite anger. It was older and quieter than anger. It was the feeling of being a fool, which was something Victoria Hale spent enormous amounts of energy trying never to be. They'd arranged it. Some configuration of people she'd trusted had looked at her life, her quiet, difficult, carefully rebuilt life, and decided it would be entertaining to watch a disabled woman get rejected on a date. They'd filmed her walking in. They were filming her now. When the date ended, when Mason made his excuses and left, they would have a video of her face in the moment it happened. She understood all of it in about 4 seconds. She picked up her water glass and took a sip. "You all right?" Mason was looking at her. "Fine," she said. "You were saying about Lily and the birdhouse. I was saying she wants to build a treehouse this summer, and I've been stalling because I know I'm going to end up doing most of the work, and I'm okay with that. I just want her to know I'm aware of the dynamic." Despite everything that was happening in the back of her mind, Victoria almost smiled. "That's very self-aware for a man with a power drill. I contain multitudes," Mason said. She looked at him. He was easy to read in some ways and harder to read in others. He was comfortable in this conversation, genuinely, not performatively comfortable. He kept his hands still when he talked, which was a thing she'd noticed because most people moved their hands too much or not enough. He'd shifted in his chair once to make room when the server came by, and he'd done it without making a thing of it. He did not look like a man who was waiting to leave, which meant either he didn't know or he was part of it. Victoria had survived corporate boardrooms for a decade by being good at reading people, and she sat now with the two possibilities in front of her and tried to parse him. He'd looked at her when he walked in. That moment. No hesitation, no recalibration. She'd clocked it. She'd made her career in part by understanding the difference between a person who was performing ease and a person who felt it. She had spent 12 minutes in a car outside this building, assessing her own fear and calling it something else, and she was good enough at honesty with herself to acknowledge that she'd been afraid. Afraid of exactly this. Of being seen first as a woman in a wheelchair and the conversation adjusting itself around that fact, everything going slightly formal and careful, the way it did with most people. Mason hadn't done that. But men could be friendly and charming right up until the moment they weren't. She made a decision. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Did anyone, Isho, Renata, or whoever connected us, tell you anything specific about me before today, beyond the basics?" Something moved across his face. Not guilt, she thought. More like a person trying to answer carefully because they wanted to answer honestly. "She told me you were smart," he said. "She said you'd gone through something hard a couple years ago. She said..." He stopped. "She said I shouldn't make a big deal out of the wheelchair. Her phrasing, not mine." "That's an interesting piece of advice." "I thought so too," Mason said. "It implied I'd need to work at it, which didn't seem right, so I mostly just tried to forget she'd said it." Victoria looked at him. "And did you? Forget she said it?" "More or less." He leaned back slightly. "I mean, I noticed. Of course I noticed. But noticing isn't the same as making it the whole story." "No," Victoria said quietly. "It isn't." She picked up the daisies from where she'd set them on the table. They were already slightly wilted from being carried through the cool air, one petal gone from the largest bloom, and they were the most honest flowers she'd been given in years. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I want to see how you react." Mason waited. "I think this date was set up as a joke," she said. "I think Renata and some other people are in this cafe right now recording us, and I think the idea was that you'd leave, that this would be humiliating for me, and they'd have it on video." She watched his face. What she saw there was not the reaction of a man who already knew. What she saw was the specific expression of someone processing something ugly that they hadn't expected to encounter. A stillness, a kind of going in on themselves, and then a tightening around the eyes that wasn't sadness and wasn't quite anger, but was somewhere in the territory between them. He looked slowly around the room, the man near the window, the women at the bar, the corner where Renata sat. His jaw worked once. "The woman in the orange coat," he said. It wasn't a question. "Among others." He was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" "About 10 minutes?" "And you kept talking to me." "I was trying to figure out if you were in on it." He looked at her directly. "I'm not." "I know," Victoria said. "I know that now." Another silence. She watched him decide something. She could see the decision happening, the settling of it. "Okay," Mason said. He reached for the menu even though they'd both already looked at it. "Do you want some coffee? Because I'd like some coffee, and I think we should stay and have it." Victoria blinked. Of all the responses she'd prepared for, this was not one she'd considered. "What?" "If we leave, they get what they wanted. They've got footage of a short date, and they can make it look like whatever they want." He set the menu down. "If we stay and have coffee and keep talking, they've got footage of two people having a nice afternoon." He paused. "I mean, assuming you want to. You don't have to. I'm not trying to make your choices for you." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "I'll have a black coffee," she said. Mason signaled the server. They stayed for another hour and 40 minutes. Victoria did not look at Renata again. She made a choice not to, the same way she made many choices in a day. Deliberate, quiet, without ceremony. She turned the camera of her attention back onto the conversation in front of her, and she stayed there. She learned that Mason's wife had been named Clara and that she died of an aneurysm 22 months ago, sudden, no warning, a Tuesday morning while Lily was at school. He told Victoria this the way people tell hard things when they've had enough time with them, that the telling has become something manageable. Not easy, never easy, but manageable. She didn't try to make it better. She asked one question, what was she like? And Mason told her. Claire had been impatient and warm and incredibly stubborn about small things, hated losing at cards, made the best chili he'd ever had, and never wrote down the recipe, which remained the thing that annoyed him most about her death. Which was a strange thing to be annoyed about. He knew that. "No, it isn't," Victoria said. "It's petty. Grief is allowed to be petty. Grief doesn't have a dress code." He looked at her. "Is that from something?" "No," she said. "I just think it's true." She learned that Mason was the kind of person who remembered what you'd said 5 minutes ago and built on it, rather than the kind of person who waited for you to stop talking so they could talk again. She learned that he was funnier than he seemed at first. Dry, low-key, the kind of humor that arrived without announcement and landed before you'd fully understood it was coming. She learned that he'd wanted to be an engineer when he was young, that he'd started community college and quit when his father got sick, that he'd gone into the shop with Dale because Dale needed a partner and Mason needed money, and that he'd found, over time, that he didn't mind the work. Actually liked it, most days. "There's something satisfying about knowing what the problem is," he said. "Cars are honest. Something's wrong. There are reasons it's wrong. You find the reasons and fix them. People aren't like that." "People are rarely honest about what the problem is," Victoria agreed. "Exactly." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "You can spend years talking around the actual problem. Are we talking about Renata? We're talking about everyone." He glanced toward the back of the cafe, then back to her. "But also, yeah, little Renata." She laughed. A real one. Surprised out of her in the same way she'd surprised a laugh out of him earlier, which struck her as a kind of symmetry. The afternoon light had shifted by now, going from amber to the thin gray blue of an October evening. The cafe had emptied slightly and filled back up with a different crowd, people coming in from work, unwinding, not yet going home. "Can I ask you something else?" Mason said. "You can try." "The company you mentioned, well, Hale Properties. You said you were in real estate." He said it without emphasis, without anything calculated behind it. "Is that like residential? Commercial?" She looked at him. "Both," she said carefully. "I run the company. Like, you're the boss. I'm the CEO." She watched his face. "It's a significant operation." He absorbed this. She waited for the thing that usually happened when men found out. The recalibration, the slight adjustment in posture, the way some men pulled back and others leaned forward in a different way, a more transactional way. She was waiting for the gears to shift. Mason nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "That explains why you were reading the room when you walked in. I thought you were just suspicious." "I was both," she said. "Does it bother people that you're—" He gestured, not at her wheelchair, she realized, but generally at her. "That you're in charge of something that big?" "Some people have complicated feelings about it, yes." He turned his coffee cup on the table. "I don't know anything about running a company that size. My business has 6 employees. Do you want to know?" "Sure," he said. "What's the hardest part?" She thought about giving him the polished answer. The version she gave in interviews, the one about vision and people management and the challenges of scale. "Knowing who to trust," she said instead. "I'm good at a lot of things, but I've been wrong about people. More than I'd like to have been." He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me too." At 4:53 p.m., Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant, which she glanced at and put back in her bag. At 5:09, Mason's phone rang. Lily, calling from his mother's house, wanting to know what they were having for dinner and whether she could finish watching a movie before he got there. Victoria heard him talk to his daughter, the shift in his voice, the specific gentling that happened, and she looked out the window at the street while he wrapped it up. When he hung up, he said, "I need to get going soon. She does better when I'm home for dinner." "Of course," Victoria said. "This was—" He stopped, looked for the word. "Not what I expected." "In a good way?" "Definitely in a good way." He paused. "Can I say something slightly awkward?" "You can try," she said again. "What they did, Renata and whoever else, that's not okay. I know you know that. I just wanted to—" He made a small, frustrated gesture. "I wanted to say it out loud. Because I think sometimes when someone's done something shitty to you, it helps to have someone else acknowledge that it was shitty." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "It helps," she said finally. "Good." He reached for the check, which had been sitting at the edge of the table for 15 minutes. We can split it. I'd actually prefer to get it, if that's all right." She looked at him. He met her look without flinching. She'd fought this battle enough times to know the difference between a man who insisted on paying because it was a power move, and a man who insisted because it mattered to him for different reasons. She let it go. "Thank you," she said. He put his card down. While they waited, he said, "My daughter asks a lot of questions about everything. I'm just telling you that up front, because if this goes anywhere, she's going to have opinions." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "If this goes anywhere, I'd like it to," he said. Simply. No performance. "If you would." She thought about the daisies, already browning slightly at the edges, one petal definitely lost somewhere between the farmer's market and this table, sitting next to her water glass. She thought about the fact that this man had looked at her when he walked in the door and not looked away. She thought about an afternoon that had been designed to humiliate her and had somehow become, against all odds, the first real conversation she'd had in longer than she wanted to count. "I would," she said. Cham. Outside, the evening had gone genuinely cold, the wind off the lake cutting down Halstead with an edge that made people flinch. Mason held the door, which required some coordination, the inward swinging door, the narrow entry, and she got through it without incident and felt the cold hit her face. "I parked on Monroe," Mason said. "I'm in the lot on the other side." She stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at him. He was backlit by the warm light spilling out of Birchwood's window, and she could see behind the glass the shapes of the people still inside. The barista restocking the pastry case, a couple lingering over drinks, the table where Renata's orange coat had been. Renata was gone. Of course she was. Victoria turned back to Mason. "For the record," she said, "this was the worst blind date I've ever been on." He laughed, surprised again. "Yeah?" "And also possibly the best conversation I've had this year." "Those two things can both be true," he said. "They can," she agreed. He got her number. She got his. He said he'd text her about maybe getting dinner sometime. Chart, a real plan, a real restaurant, not arranged by anyone else. And she said yes. He turned toward Monroe. She turned toward the lot. She was half a block away when she heard him call back. "Hey, Victoria?" She stopped, turned her chair. He was standing under a streetlight, hands in his pockets, the cold air moving around him. The daisies were a good call, right? She looked at the flowers in her lap, already beat up, already a little sad-looking, and entirely themselves. Yeah, she said. They were a good call. She turned back toward the lot. She didn't let herself think about what was waiting for her. The video that Renata's circle was probably already editing, the exposure it would mean, the complications that were going to land on her desk before the week was out. There would be time for all of that. There was always time for complications. Right now, in the 11 seconds it took her to reach the corner, Victoria Hale let herself have the afternoon. The coffee. The imperfect daisies. A man who'd said this must have required a hell of a lot of adjusting and hadn't waited for her to thank him for it. She turned the corner and the wind came off the lake, and she drove herself toward the car with her head up, the way she always did, the way she'd learned to do, the way she would keep doing long after this October evening was nothing but a story she told sometimes to explain how things began. She didn't block Renata's number that night. She thought about it. She sat in her apartment on the 14th floor with the Chicago skyline doing its usual thing outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, all that cold light stacked up against the dark, and she held her phone and looked at Renata's contact for a long time. 3 years of text history. Birthday messages. The kind of friendship that had survived, she'd thought, the accident and the rehabilitation and the restructuring of an entire life. She put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and made herself dinner instead. Pasta, nothing elaborate, something to do with her hands. The daisies were in a glass of water on the windowsill because she didn't own a vase, had never needed one, had never been the kind of woman who kept flowers in her apartment. She looked at them while she ate. Mason texted at 8:14 p.m. Just got Lily to bed. Tonight took an unexpected turn. In a good way, I think. Hope you got home okay. She read it twice, which she told herself was normal. She typed back, I did. Your instinct about staying was right. She hesitated, then added, The daisies are on my windowsill. His response came after a few minutes. Good. They're better than roses. She set the phone down and finished her pasta and went to bed. She lay in the dark with the city light leaking around the curtains and thought about the man near the window with his phone at the wrong angle and the way Renata had positioned herself behind a column as though that made any difference at all, and the specific weight of realizing that people you've trusted have been looking at you and seen something worth mocking. She'd been mocked before. She'd been underestimated and dismissed, and talked over and talked around. She'd been in rooms where people looked at her wheelchair first and adjusted everything else accordingly. She'd built a career partly on the fuel of other people's underestimation, and she was too honest with herself to pretend that hadn't cost something, accumulating over years into a kind of quiet exhaustion she didn't have a name for. What she hadn't expected going into that cafe was to come out of it feeling less tired than when she'd gone in. She didn't know what to do with that, so she went to sleep. The video posted 3 days later. Okay. She found out the way she found out most things she didn't want to know, through her assistant, a 26-year-old named Priya, who had the particular skill of delivering bad news with the same neutral professionalism she used to deliver good news, which Victoria had always appreciated, and which sometimes made the bad news land harder than it should. There's something trending this morning that involves you, Priya said, standing in the doorway of Victoria's office on the 32nd floor of the Hale Properties building. I wanted to flag it before the 11 o'clock. The video had been edited. That was the first thing Victoria noticed when Priya showed her the screen. Someone had spent time on it, had cut it in a particular way, adding text overlays and zooming in on certain moments. The title in block letters read, CEO. Eris thinks she's too good for real men. Watch till the end. It had 400,000 views. Victoria watched it with her hands still in her lap and her face doing the thing it did when she needed it to not do anything. Composed, readable as nothing, a skill she'd developed so thoroughly over the years that sometimes she forgot she was doing it. The video had been cut to tell a specific story. It opened with her arriving at Birchwood. The door, the threshold, the moment of navigation. And whoever had edited it had slowed that section down slightly, just enough to make it feel labored. Then it cut to Mason walking in. Then it cut to the part of the conversation that was visible from across the room. Victoria leaning back, Victoria's expression during a moment when she'd been thinking hard about something Mason said, and it had evidently read from a distance as coldness. There was a section where it appeared, from the angle and the cut, that Mason had looked uncomfortable. He hadn't been uncomfortable. He'd been annoyed, she knew now, about Renata. that tightening around his eyes, but the edit made it look like something else. The last 30 seconds of the video showed her leaving. The text overlay read, "She couldn't even say thank you. Some people don't deserve kindness." Priya said nothing. Victoria handed back the phone. "How many of the board have seen it?" Victoria asked. "I don't have confirmed numbers, but Warren Chu's assistant called this morning asking whether you'd be available for a call today." Warren Chu. Victoria ran through what she knew about Warren in the 3 seconds she had available, which was extensive. 17 years on the Hale Properties Board. Old money Chicago family, the kind that had opinions about how a company should be led and by whom, and had expressed those opinions only indirectly, only when they thought they could make them stick. He'd voted against her appointment as CEO 4 years ago. He'd been cordial about it ever since, which was the particular cordiality of a man waiting for an opportunity. "Tell him I'm available Thursday," Victoria said. "Not today," Priya made the note. "There's also the comments." She paused. "Some of them are fairly aggressive. Our PR team is monitoring." "I'll talk to PR this afternoon." Victoria moved her chair toward her desk, which was her signal that the conversation was over, and Priya took it. At the door she paused. "For what it's worth," Priya said, "you can tell in the actual video that you were having a good time if people watch it with the sound up." "The sound is off on most of those views," Victoria said. Priya nodded and left. Victoria sat alone in her office for 2 minutes, which was all she allowed herself. Then she opened her laptop and started working. Mason called that evening. She'd texted him a heads up. "The video is out, it's been edited badly, you should probably know." And he'd called instead of texting back, which she'd half expected. "I saw it," he said. "Dale showed me this morning." "I'm sorry." "Why are you apologizing?" "Because your face is in it. Because your name is probably attached to searches now. Because this is a mess that got handed to you." "Victoria," his voice was even. "I'm a 32-year-old mechanic from Evanston. My name attaching to anything with 400,000 views is..." He paused. "Honestly, it's kind of impressive. In a bad way." She surprised herself by laughing, which she hadn't done once in the 8 hours since Priya had walked into her office. "I have a PR team dealing with it," she said, "and a legal team looking at whether there's anything actionable." "Is there?" "Depends on what we can demonstrate about intent, but probably not enough to be worth pursuing publicly." She stopped at her window, the city below doing its evening thing, lights coming on in waves. "The more useful thing is to just let it run its course. These things have a half-life." "Have you done this before? The public, whatever, the media attention thing?" "Occasionally. Nothing quite like this, but yes." She looked at her own reflection in the dark glass, which she tried not to do as a habit. "It's unpleasant. It passes." "You don't sound particularly bothered." "I am, actually. I'm just practiced at not sounding it." A pause on his end. She could hear in the background the small sounds of his house. A television at low volume, something that might have been Lily's voice in another room. The particular texture of a home with someone small in it. "Can I ask you something?" Mason said, and she recognized the phrasing because he'd used it at the cafe. "What is the video actually messing with? Like, is it the company stuff or is it something else?" She thought about giving him the corporate answer. The board, the investors, the timing with the Millhaven project. Then she thought about the way he'd talked about Clara. Not polishing it, not softening it, just telling her what was true. And she said, "Both. The company stuff is real and I'll deal with it. But the other thing is..." She stopped. "They made me look like someone who can't be kind to a person who was kind to her. That one bothers me more." "I know," Mason said. "I watched it. They made you look like you were sitting there tolerating me." "You were the best part of my week." She heard the words leave her mouth and couldn't quite believe she'd said them. There was a half-second of silence. "Mine too," Mason said. "And I fixed a pretty complicated transmission on Thursday, so that's saying something." She shook her head, smiling at her own reflection. "I need to go. Early morning tomorrow." "Yeah." A pause. "Victoria, this is going to sound... I don't know how it's going to sound, but I'd like to take you to dinner Saturday. Not because of the video, because I said I would and I meant it, and I don't think we should let someone else's garbage change that." She thought about the board, about Warren Chu's assistant calling on a Tuesday morning, about the comments she hadn't read but could imagine, because she'd been a woman in public for long enough to know exactly the shape they took. "Saturday," she said. Yes. Hmm. The restaurant he chose was a place in Lincoln Square called Oaken, which had been around for almost 20 years, and was the kind of place that had outlasted trends by never chasing them. Wood-paneled walls, a menu that changed with the season, enough noise that conversations felt private. Mason had been there once before, for his and Clara's 4th anniversary, and when he'd made the reservation, he'd almost chosen somewhere else for that reason, then decided that avoiding every place that held a memory was its own kind of trap. He told Victoria this when she arrived, because he'd learned from 40 Minutes in a Cafe that she preferred the actual version of things. Was that strange? She asked, pulling up to the table. Choosing the same place? A little, he said. Not bad strange, just strange. You know how some things are strange, and you're okay with it? I do know that feeling, she said. The restaurant had good lighting and a table that accommodated her without anyone having to rearrange anything. He noticed her noticing that. She didn't say anything about it, and he didn't, and they moved on. The conversation at dinner was different from the conversation at Birchwood. At Birchwood, they'd been finding out whether they could talk to each other. Here, they already knew they could, so they went somewhere further. He told her more about Lily, the birdhouse. Yes. And also the phase Lily had gone through 6 months after Clara died, when she'd stopped eating at the table and would only eat sitting in the closet in her room, which had lasted 2 weeks, and which Mason had handled by sitting in the closet with her at every meal until she was ready to come out. The pediatrician said it was a coping mechanism, he said. I said yes, and I ate a lot of meals in a small space. That's a good instinct, Victoria said. I mostly just didn't want to fight with her about it. She had enough going on. That's still a good instinct. Victoria told him about her company, more than she told him at the cafe, more than she told most people. About starting at Hale Properties as an entry-level analyst at 22, which was a thing people always found surprising because they assumed she'd inherited it, which she had in part. Her father had founded it. But she'd also had to prove herself inside it more completely than anyone hired from outside ever had, because the people who'd been there before her had specific ideas about what family money meant versus earned authority. About becoming CEO at 28, which had been 2 years of politics she didn't entirely want to relitigate. About the accident at 30, a car that had run a red light on a rainy November evening, 40 miles per hour, driver who'd been awake for 22 hours. And the 6 weeks in the hospital, and the realization somewhere in month 4 of rehabilitation that she was going to be angry about it for a long time, and that was okay. And also she needed to run her company. Did people try to take it from you? Mason asked. After the accident. Some tried, quietly, the way people try things quietly when they think they have time. She turned her wine glass on the table. I came back before they expected me to. That helped. How long were you out? 8 weeks? I was doing calls from the hospital at week 4. She paused. My doctor was not thrilled. I'll bet. He leaned back. Was that the right call? Looking back? She considered it genuinely, which was something she didn't always do. I think it was the right call for the company, she said. For me, personally. Maybe I could have given myself more time. But I don't know who I would have been on the other side of more time. I think I needed the work. Something to be other than the person the accident happened to. She looked at him. Yes, exactly that. He didn't say anything to fill the silence, which was the right thing not to do. The second time she met Lily was an accident. The first time had been intentional. 2 weeks after dinner at Oaken, Mason had asked if Victoria wanted to see the shop, and she'd said yes, and Lily had been there because school had let out early for a teacher workday, and Mason's mother had a dentist appointment. Lily had been doing homework on a cleared workbench with the focused solemnity of a child who took homework seriously, and she'd looked up at Victoria with Clara's dark eyes and said, Are you the lady from Dad's phone? Probably, Victoria said. He has a picture of you from the internet. Mason, from under a car, said, Lily. It's a nice picture, Lily said, by way of clarification. The second time was the accident. Victoria had been driving past Mason's neighborhood, genuinely driving past, en route to a site visit for the Millhaven project, when she'd gotten a text from him. Weird question, but are you anywhere near Evanston? Lily's school called, she's sick. I'm 40 minutes out and Mom can't get there for an hour. Office building on Dodge, I'm stuck. She'd looked at the text and looked at her route and texted back, I'm 12 minutes away. She sat with Lily in the school nurse's office for an hour and 7 minutes. Lily had a fever of 101 and a headache, and the specific misery of a child who is sick enough to feel terrible, but not sick enough to sleep. She lay on the cot with her jacket folded under her head and looked at Victoria with a directness that children had sometimes and adults almost never. "Does it hurt?" Lily asked. "Your legs." "Not anymore," Victoria said. "They don't feel much of anything." "Is that worse than hurting?" Victoria thought about it. "Sometimes. It's different." Lily considered this. "My head hurts a lot right now." "I know. That's the worst part of a fever." Victoria moved her chair closer to the cot. "Do you want me to tell you something to think about instead?" "Like what?" "I don't know yet. What are you interested in?" Lily looked at the ceiling. "Building stuff, and animals, and whether there are planets we haven't found yet." "There probably are," Victoria said. "We've only looked at a small part of what's out there." "That's kind of scary." "It is. It's also kind of incredible." Lily turned her head on the jacket pillow and looked at Victoria. "Dad says you run a big company." "I do." "Do you like it?" "Most of the time," Victoria considered. "The parts I like are when I get to build something that didn't exist before. We're working on a housing project right now. It's a whole community, but designed so that people who use wheelchairs or walkers or who have different needs can live there without things being hard." Lily's eyes sharpened with interest, which was the first sign of life she'd shown in an hour. "Like your wheelchair?" "Like my wheelchair. And other people's too." "So it's a neighborhood where everything works right." Victoria paused. "That's a better description than the one I use in my presentations." Lily almost smiled. "You should use mine." "I might." Mason arrived 23 minutes later, breathless and apologetic, his work shirt still carrying the faint smell of motor oil. Lily was half asleep by then, Victoria sitting beside her reading emails on her phone, and Mason stopped in the doorway of the nurse's office and looked at the scene for a moment with an expression Victoria didn't analyze because it felt private. "Hey, Bug," he said quietly, moving past Victoria to put his hand on Lily's forehead. "I'm here." "Victoria told me about planets," Lily said, without opening her eyes. "Did she?" "There are more ones we haven't found." "I know." He looked over at Victoria. "Thank you," he said. The way he said it made the two words carry more than two words usually carried, and Victoria looked away first. "She wasn't any trouble," Victoria said. "You didn't have to do this." "I was 12 minutes away." She put her phone in her bag. "I'll get out of your way." "You don't have to. I have a site visit." She moved toward the door and stopped beside him. This close, she could see the tension that the 40-minute drive had put in his jaw, the particular fear that lived in a single parent's body any time their child needed them, and they weren't there. "She's going to be fine," Victoria said, low enough that it was only for him. "It's just a fever," he exhaled. "Yeah." A pause. "Dinner this week?" "The three of us, if that's okay." She looked back at Lily, who had pulled her jacket pillow more firmly under her cheek. "The three of us," Victoria said. "Yes." She didn't see the article until Monday morning, and by then it had been picked up by 4 business outlets. Hale Properties. CEO's personal life goes viral. Board members raising questions about leadership stability. It was not a news article. It had the shape of one. The publication it appeared in was legitimate, business-focused, the kind of outlet that fund managers read. But Victoria had been in corporate life long enough to recognize a place story. Someone had gone to a journalist with a package. The Birchwood video. A set of quotes from anonymous sources described as current and former Hale Properties executives, and a narrative about a CEO whose judgment had come into question. The quotes were specific enough that they hadn't been invented. Someone on the inside had talked. The narrative ran like this. Victoria Hale, already a controversial choice for CEO, given her disability and relative youth at appointment, had now become a public relations liability. The Birchwood video demonstrated, the article suggested, a pattern of behavior that some within the company found concerning, an unwillingness to engage professionally, an isolation that had grown since the accident, a CEO more focused on personal matters than on the challenges facing the company. The challenges facing the company, the article noted, included a significant debt position related to the Millhaven Accessible Housing Project, whose financing had become complicated in the last quarter due to, and here the article became vague in a specific way that Victoria recognized, certain strategic disagreements among senior leadership. She read the article 3 times. Then she called her general counsel, a woman named Frances Park, who had been with Hale Properties for 11 years, and who had the particular quality of being unrattled by almost anything. "Francis," Victoria said when she picked up. "Someone leaked the Millhaven financing details." "I know. I've been on the phone since 6 this morning." "Who?" "I have 3 candidates," Francis said. "I need 48 hours." "You have 24. Victoria looked out her office window at the November sky, which was the color of unfinished concrete. "And I need you to pull every NDA we have signed in the last 18 months related to the project. Everyone." "Already requested." A pause. "Victoria, the board is convening Thursday. Warren called it." She'd known it was coming. Had known it since Priya had told her about Warren's assistant calling on the Tuesday morning after the video. She'd bought herself 2 weeks by maneuvering Thursday to Thursday, and she'd used those 2 weeks well. She'd documented, she'd analyzed, she'd quietly spoken with 5 of the 9 board members she trusted, and she'd positioned her arguments for the meeting like chess pieces she hadn't moved yet. But she hadn't known they had the Millhaven details. Whoever had placed this article had handed Warren Chu exactly what he needed. "Who's on the agenda?" she asked. "The article. The Millhaven timeline. And—" Francis paused, which was unusual. Francis didn't pause. "There's an agenda item called Leadership Evaluation that wasn't run by your office." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "He's going to try to force a confidence vote." "That's my read." She thought about the article, the anonymous quotes, the careful framing of her disability as a controversial element of her appointment, not inflammatory enough to be actionable, but present enough to sit there on the page, doing its work. She thought about Mason sitting in his shop under a car while Lily did homework on a workbench. She thought about Lily in the nurse's office saying a neighborhood where everything works right. She thought about the Millhaven project. 3 years of her life. Every complicated negotiation and financing structure and design revision, the things she was most proud of and most afraid of simultaneously, the project that was supposed to prove that accessible design could be profitable and beautiful and real, rather than institutional and apologetic. She wasn't going to lose it to Warren Chu in a planted article, and whoever inside her company had decided their interests were better served by her absence. "Set up a call with the institutional investors," she said. "The top 7 by position. I want to talk to all of them before Thursday. They may not all be available on short notice." "Make them available." She moved her chair toward her desk. "And Francis, find me who talked to that journalist. I don't care how long it takes after Thursday. I want to know." "Understood." Another pause. "How are you?" It was an unusual question for Francis, which meant it was a real one. "I'm fine," Victoria said, which was the answer she gave. After she hung up, she sat alone for a moment. Just a moment. The city below was its usual Tuesday self. Cabs and delivery trucks and people in coats walking fast with their chins down against the cold. The skyline did its thing. The lake was gray and wide and indifferent to everything happening on the 32nd floor of the building above it. Her phone buzzed. "Mason. Lily's fever broke. She wants me to tell Victoria about the exoplanet thing she looked up last night." A pause, then another message. "Also, she drew a picture of your wheelchair that's actually pretty accurate. I don't know what to do with this kid." Victoria looked at the messages for a moment. She wrote back, "Tell her I want to see it, and tell her the planet she finds is hers to name." She put the phone in her bag and opened her laptop and started building her case for Thursday. The calls to the institutional investors took 2 days and cost Victoria something she didn't have a clean word for. Not energy exactly, more like a specific reserve she kept for situations where she had to be completely present and completely controlled at the same time, which was its own kind of exhausting. 7 calls. 7 different configurations of the same essential conversation. Reassurance delivered as data, confidence delivered as fact. The Millhaven numbers walked through with the precision of someone who had built every projection herself and could answer any question from memory. 6 of the 7 went well. The 7th, a fund manager named Gerald Ostroff, whose firm held 4% of Hale Properties, asked her, near the end of a 40-minute call, whether the recent media attention had affected her ability to focus on her responsibilities. He asked it in the way people ask things they already had an answer to. "No," Victoria said. "Has it affected your confidence in the company's fundamentals?" A pause. "The fundamentals are sound." "Then we agree on what matters," she said. After she hung up, she sat alone in the conference room where she'd taken all the calls, the table around her covered with printed projections she no longer needed, and she pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed for about 30 seconds. Then she stacked the papers and went back to her office. Priya had left a note on her desk. Frances called. She has a name. The name was Derek Paulson. Derek had been VP of Strategic Development at Hale Properties for 3 years. He was 41, well-dressed in the way of men who spent money on clothes to communicate something, and he had a manner in meetings that Victoria had always found slightly off. Agreeable on the surface, watchful underneath. The kind of person whose support arrived in writing and whose doubts arrived in private conversations she wasn't part of. She'd kept him because he was good at his job, which was a calculation she'd made, and which she now understood she'd made wrong. Frances laid it out on Wednesday afternoon, the day before the board meeting. Derek had met with the journalist 3 times, twice in person, once by phone. He'd provided the Millhaven financing documents, which he'd had legitimate access to through his role. He'd also, Frances believed, been the one to connect Renata Simmons to the people who'd arranged the Birchwood setup, though that chain was harder to prove. He knew Renata, Victoria asked. They're both in the same business network. Young professionals of Chicago a few years back. We found the connection through his calendar. Frances set a folder on Victoria's desk. He's been in contact with Warren Chu's office directly. 6 calls in the last 60 days. Victoria opened the folder. Derek's calendar entries printed with certain lines highlighted in yellow. She looked at them without touching them. He was building a case for Thursday, she said. That's my read. The article was meant to arrive before the board meeting to soften the institutional investors. If 2 or 3 of them came into today's call already uncertain about you, Warren would have had the votes. Frances paused. He might still have them. We don't know where Ostroff lands. Ostroff lands where the numbers land, Victoria said. He's transactional. That I can work with. She closed the folder. Derek's access to company systems needs to be restricted by end of day today. Quietly. I don't want him to know we know before tomorrow morning. Done. What about legal? After Thursday. If I'm still here after Thursday, we pursue it properly. She looked at Frances. And if I'm not, it won't matter. Frances, who had the quality of never offering reassurance when it wasn't useful, said nothing. Thank you, Victoria said. Go home, get some sleep. You should do the same. I will. She wouldn't, and they both knew it, and they left it there. She called Mason that night at 9:30. She hadn't planned to, had been sitting at her kitchen table with the Millhaven project documents spread around her, annotating her remarks for the morning, when she'd looked up and realized she needed to hear a voice that wasn't going to ask her anything strategic. He picked up on the second ring. Hey. Background noise. The television she was starting to recognize as his default evening sound. How are you doing? I've been better, she said. I've also been worse. Big day tomorrow. Very. She leaned back in her chair. I'm not calling to talk about it, actually. I've been talking about it for 2 days straight. Okay. He moved. She could hear him settle somewhere, maybe the couch. Lily asked about you today. She wants to know if you've looked up the exoplanet thing. I have, actually. I read 3 papers during lunch. She's 8. I'll translate. He laughed, and the specific ease of that sound did something to the tension in Victoria's shoulders that nothing in the past 48 hours had managed. She turned her pen end over end on the table. Mason, she said. Yeah. After tomorrow, whatever happens, I want to take Lily to the Millhaven site. The construction is far enough along that you can see what it's going to be. I want her to see it. She paused. She's the one who told me what it was, actually, in the nurse's office. A neighborhood where everything works right. I've been thinking about that for 2 weeks. She'd love that, he said. She's been asking when she can come. After tomorrow, then. After tomorrow, he agreed. She looked at the document spread across her kitchen table. 3 years of work. Other people's money and her judgment and a vision of something that didn't exist yet but was being built, stubbornly, in a piece of land in the south side that had been empty and broken-windowed for a decade. I should let you go, she said. You should sleep. I'm going to. She wasn't. Good night, Mason. Good night, Victoria. You'll be fine tomorrow. She didn't respond to that because she knew it was something people said and not something you could actually know, and he knew that too. And she appreciated that he'd said it anyway. The Hale Properties boardroom was on the 34th floor, 2 floors above Victoria's office, and it had been designed by someone who believed that authority was communicated through ceiling height and unobstructed views of the lake. The table seated 14, On Thursday morning, it held 9, the full board. And the energy in the room when Victoria came in at 8:58 was the specific energy of people who had already been talking about you. She knew that energy. She'd been in enough rooms like it. She took her position at the head of the table, which was her position, and she looked at each face in turn while Priya set a folder in front of her. Warren Chu was to her left, fourth seat down. He was 63, silver-haired, with the settled quality of a man who had rarely been surprised by anything in a very long time. He looked back at her with a cordiality that hadn't changed in 4 years, and she understood that he believed today was the day the cordiality would no longer need to be maintained. 2 seats beyond Warren sat a woman named Audra Bell, who had been on the board for 8 years and whom Victoria trusted more than anyone else in the room. Audra caught her eye and gave her nothing, just a steady look that meant, "I'm here," which was enough. "Let's begin," Victoria said. Warren led the first portion of the meeting. He was good at it, measured, professional, letting the structure of the agenda do the work rather than appearing to push. The article was discussed as a reputational matter, which was the language of someone who had chosen his words carefully. The Millhaven financing was presented as a concern, requiring board clarity. Each item was framed as reasonable inquiry, which meant Victoria had to answer it as reasonable inquiry rather than what it was. She answered. Precisely, from documentation, without over-explaining, over-explanation in a boardroom was its own signal, the signal of someone defending rather than leading. She had the numbers. She had the projections. She had a revised timeline for Millhaven's Phase 2 financing that addressed the specific concerns raised in the article, which she walked through in 11 minutes because she'd built the thing and could explain it in her sleep. She watched the room as she talked. 3 of the 9 were Warren's. She'd mapped this in advance, had known for years which relationships he'd cultivated. 2 were genuinely undecided, reading her the way investors read any presentation, looking for the thing the numbers didn't say. The remaining 4 she had confidence in, including Audra. The math was 5-4 if she lost the undecideds, and she didn't know where Ostrov's call had landed. Warren waited until she'd finished her Millhaven presentation. Then he set his hands flat on the table in a gesture that she recognized as his version of "here it comes." "Victoria," he said, "I think what several of us are grappling with, and I want to be respectful of everything you've accomplished here, is a broader question about capacity, about whether the demands of leading a company at this scale, given everything on your plate personally, are sustainable going forward." She looked at him. She didn't say anything immediately, which was deliberate. "I'd like you to be specific," she said finally. "When you say capacity, what specifically are you questioning?" Warren held her look. "The Millhaven timeline has slipped. The financing structure has gaps. There was a public situation that resulted in media coverage that's concerned our investors. I'm raising the question that others have raised privately, whether this is a moment for leadership transition." "A leadership transition," Victoria said. "You mean you want me to step down?" "I mean, the board should have that conversation openly. We're having it right now," she said. "So let's have it." She opened her folder. "Before we discuss capacity, I'd like to discuss how the Millhaven financing details reached a business journalist, because that's a material information breach, and it happened from inside this company, and I know who did it." The room shifted. She felt it. A change in the atmospheric pressure, 3 or 4 people sitting differently. Warren's cordiality didn't change. "That's a serious allegation." "It's a documented fact." She slid a single page from her folder, a summary of Francis's findings, dates, and call records, and a timeline. She passed copies to Audra, who distributed them. Derek Paulson, VP of Strategic Development, met with the journalist responsible for the article 3 times in the 2 weeks prior to publication. He provided the Millhaven financing documents. "He also has a documented series of direct contacts with your office, Warren. 6 calls in 60 days, none of which were disclosed to me or logged in board communications." She watched Warren's face. The cordiality stayed, but something behind it rearranged itself. She'd seen that rearrangement before. The specific look of someone whose plan has hit a variable they hadn't fully accounted for. "Those calls," Warren began. "I'm not accusing you of anything today," Victoria said. "I'm presenting documented information that the board should have before any vote. Because if there is a motion today related to leadership, the board needs to know that the basis for that motion includes information that was obtained through a breach of fiduciary duty." She let that sit for 3 seconds. "I'll take questions." There was a silence. The undecided board member to Warren's right, A man named Franklin Cross, who'd made his money in logistics and had been on the Hale Properties Board for 2 years, looked from the summary page to Victoria and back. "Who's seen this documentation?" Franklin asked. "My general counsel compiled it. You're looking at a summary. The full file is available to any board member who requests it. When did you get this?" "Wednesday afternoon." Franklin set the page down. He had the look of a man recalculating. "And Derek is still employed." "His system access was restricted yesterday," Victoria said. "I wanted the board to have this information before any personnel action. That seemed like the right order." Another silence. Warren said carefully, "This doesn't resolve the underlying questions about Warren." It was Audra, calm and without particular inflection. "Let the room read the document." Warren looked at Audra. Audra looked back. There was a history between them that Victoria had always been aware of. They'd been on 2 other boards together. Audra had opposed Warren's preferred candidates in 2 different nomination processes over the years, and it lived in the look they exchanged now. Warren said nothing more. The room read. The motion for a leadership evaluation never came to a vote. Franklin Cross asked for a recess at 10:15, and during the 20-minute recess, Victoria sat in the small anteroom adjacent to the boardroom with a cup of coffee she didn't drink and her hands in her lap, and she looked at the painting on the wall across from her. A large abstract, blues and grays, something that had been chosen for this space by a decorator who'd been hired before Victoria's time, and she thought about nothing very productive. Audra came in at the 12-minute mark. "Franklin's moving away from Warren," Audra said, sitting down across from her. "The documentation shook him. He doesn't like being in a position where he was almost used." "And Ostroff?" Victoria asked. "Ostroff called Franklin this morning, apparently. Said the fundamentals were sound." Audra looked at her steadily. "You had that call 2 days ago." "Yes." "You were preparing for this." "I was doing my job," Victoria said, which was both true and not quite the complete picture, and Audra knew that, and neither of them elaborated. "Warren's not done," Audra said. "He's going to regroup. He didn't get the votes today, but the Millhaven timeline is a real issue, not just a manufactured one, and he'll use it again if you slip." "The timeline is 4 weeks behind," Victoria said. "We'll recover it by Q1. Can you do that?" "Yes." She said it without hedging because she wasn't hedging. "The financing gap is closable. I have 2 conversations scheduled for next week that I expect to resolve it." Audra looked at her for a moment. "I believe you," she said. "Make sure the board believes you before Warren finds another angle." "I know." Audra stood. "Derek's going to be a problem. He's going to get ahead of his termination if you don't move quickly. Francis is filing the documentation with HR today. Legal has the information breach piece." Victoria picked up the coffee she hadn't drunk and set it down again. "He'll be gone by Friday." They went back in. Done. The motion that came to a vote instead was a resolution of confidence proposed by Audra, seconded by Franklin Cross. It passed 7-2. Warren and 1 ally voted against. Everyone else voted for it. Victoria accepted it the way she accepted most things that went her way, without visible relief, because visible relief looked like surprise, and she couldn't afford to look surprised by her own competence. She stayed in the boardroom after the others had filed out, under the pretense of gathering her documents. In practice, she needed 4 minutes alone in the room, which she took, sitting at the head of the table with the lake spread out gray and enormous through the windows behind the empty chairs. She thought about Derek Paulson, who had spent months building a case against her, and who had underestimated what she kept in her files and how fast Francis moved. She thought about Warren, whose cordiality would return by Monday, and whose next angle she was already trying to anticipate. She thought about the Millhaven timeline. 4 weeks behind, closable, but real, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even inside her own head. Then she thought about a different thing. An 8-year-old in a nurse's office, sick with a fever, describing a housing project in a sentence that cut to the center of it. A neighborhood where everything works right. The clarity of that. The way a child could see the thing you were trying to do more clearly than the people arguing about financing structures and leadership capacity and what a CEO in a wheelchair could or couldn't handle. She picked up her phone and texted Mason. "Still here." His response was immediate. "I know. Lily made you a card this morning. I didn't tell her to." Victoria looked at that message for a long moment. "Tell her I want it," she wrote back. "I'm coming to Evanston tonight if that's okay." "It's okay," he wrote. "I'll make dinner. Fair warning, it might just be pasta." "Pasta is fine," she wrote. "Pasta is great." She put the phone away and gathered her documents and went back down to the 32nd floor to deal with the rest of her day, which was considerable. But the thing that was carrying her now was different from what had carried her into the boardroom that morning. Less armor and more something else. Something she was still learning the shape of, still getting used to feeling. Derek Paulson was notified on Friday at 2 p.m. in Francis's office, with HR present. Victoria was not in the room. She didn't need to be, and she'd learned years ago that presence at a termination was about something other than the decision, and she had no interest in that. He would know the reasons. The documentation would follow through legal channels. That was enough. What she heard through Francis afterward was that he'd been quiet, had asked one question, whether she had known before Thursday, and when Francis confirmed she had, he'd been quiet again for a long time. Then he'd asked for an hour to collect his things. He got the hour. She didn't think about Derek Paulson for the rest of that afternoon. She had calls, a review of the Millhaven revised projections, a conversation with the Phase 2 architect about a modification to the ground floor unit specifications that a consultant had flagged. That last call ran 45 minutes and ended with an agreement to revisit the entry width on 12 units, which was a real improvement and which cost them 6 days on the revised timeline. She accepted that. 6 days was recoverable. At 5:30, she cleared her desk. At 6, she was on the expressway north toward Evanston, the Friday traffic thick but moving, the city dissolving slowly into the older, quieter streets of the suburbs she'd driven through dozens of times without ever having a reason to stop. Mason lived on a side street 3 blocks from a public library in a house that was old in the way of solid things, 2 stories, a covered porch, a yard that had clearly been worked on but had not been worked on lately, leaves still gathered along the fence from November. There was a basketball hoop in the driveway at a height that had been lowered for an 8-year-old and probably not restored to its original position in over a year. A porch light was on. She sat in her car for a moment, not the same way she'd sat outside Birchwood, not assessing, not steeling herself, just looking at a lit window and a porch light and a basketball hoop and letting the week land for a second before she went in. The door opened before she'd gotten halfway up the path. Lily stood in the doorway in socks and a sweatshirt that had a planet on it. Saturn, the rings clearly depicted. And she was holding a folded piece of paper with the focused solemnity of someone carrying something important. "Dad said you won," Lily said. "I did," Victoria said. Lily held out the card. Victoria took it. She opened it. Inside, in the large, deliberate handwriting of a child who took printing seriously, it said, "Good job, Victoria. I made the wheelchair right this time." Below the words was a drawing, a woman in a wheelchair, dark hair, and a building in the background with what appeared to be a ramp drawn in careful detail and labeled in smaller letters, "Ramp, works right." Victoria looked at the drawing for a moment. "The ramp is very accurate," she said. "I looked it up," Lily said. "They have different kinds." "They do." Victoria folded the card. "Lily, this is the best thing I've gotten all week." Lily considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Dad made pasta," she said. "He says it's not fancy, but I think it's good." "Pasta is great," Victoria said. She followed Lily inside, the door swinging wide enough that nothing caught, nothing required navigation, and from the kitchen came the sound of something on the stove and Mason's voice saying, "Is that her?" And Lily shouting back, "Yes, and she liked the card." And then the particular noise of a house that had people in it going about the business of an ordinary Friday evening. Victoria stopped just inside the entryway for 1 second. The week had been the hardest in recent memory. There would be more weeks like it. Warren wasn't finished. The Millhaven timeline needed tending. Someone inside her company had betrayed her, and she was still processing the specific weight of that. None of it was resolved. Most of it was just managed, for now, and management wasn't the same as resolution, and she knew that. But she was standing in a house that smelled like garlic and pasta water and a child's art supplies, and there was a card in her hand with a carefully drawn ramp labeled "Works Right," and from the kitchen someone called her name. She went in. Winter came to Chicago the way it always did. Not gradually, not with any particular announcement, just a Tuesday morning when the temperature dropped 16 degrees by noon and the lake went the color of old pewter and stayed that way until March. The construction crews at Millhaven worked through it. Victoria had been clear about the timeline from the moment she'd stood in that boardroom and told 7 board members she could recover 4 weeks of schedule, and she did not intend to make herself a liar. She was on site every Thursday. That had been Mason's influence, though she hadn't told him so directly. He'd mentioned once, over dinner at his kitchen table, that the mechanics he trusted most were the ones who worked on cars rather than talked about them, and she'd thought about that for 3 days before restructuring her Thursday afternoons. It was different, seeing the project in person versus reading reports. Things showed up in person that didn't show up in documentation. A drainage grade that was technically within spec but would cause problems after the first hard freeze. A doorway width in Building C that measured correctly on paper and was wrong in reality by 2 inches. 2 inches that mattered enormously if you were using a wheelchair or a walker. She flagged everything she found. The architect, a woman named Dara Osei, who had designed 3 accessible residential projects before Millhaven and who had the particular quality of caring more about getting it right than about being told she'd gotten it wrong, received Victoria's Thursday notes every week and implemented corrections without defensiveness. This was rarer than it should have been. The financing gap closed in January, through 2 conversations Victoria had scheduled before she'd ever walked out of that boardroom. The second of those conversations, with a pension fund administrator in Minneapolis named Ruth Chen, who had been on Victoria's list for 2 years, and who, it turned out, had a brother who used a motorized chair, lasted 3 hours and produced a commitment that resolved the Millhaven Phase 2 funding entirely. Victoria flew home from Minneapolis on a Thursday evening, called Francis from the airport, and then called Mason. "It's done," she said. "The financing. Done as in done, fully committed. We're building the whole thing." A pause on his end. She could hear him exhale. "Okay," he said. "That's Victoria. That's huge." "It is," she agreed. She was standing in the departures terminal with her bag in her lap and people moving around her in every direction, and she felt the kind of tired that was specifically the aftermath of something sustained over a long time finally releasing its grip. "I'm getting on a plane. I just wanted to tell you." "I'm glad you told me first," he said. She hadn't consciously decided to call him before Francis. She thought about that on the flight home, Mum. The small geometry of who you called first and what it said, and whether she was ready for what it said. She wasn't entirely sure, but she'd made the call. The site visit she'd promised Lily happened on a Saturday in February, the ground frozen hard under 6 inches of snow that had fallen in the night and hadn't been fully cleared from the paths yet. Mason had tried once, gently, to suggest that maybe a construction site in February wasn't the ideal field trip, and Victoria had looked at him in a way that closed the subject. She'd arranged it properly. Hard hats for all 3 of them, including a child-sized one that Lily put on with the gravity of someone accepting a professional title, and a site manager named Bertrand who knew the project as well as anyone and who handled Lily's questions with the genuine patience of a man who had kids of his own and understood that their questions were often better than adults. Lily had a lot of questions. She wanted to know why the doorways were wider than normal doorways. She wanted to know how the elevator buttons worked for someone who couldn't see them. She wanted to know about the parking spaces and the ramp grades and the kitchen counter heights that could be adjusted. And Bertrand answered each one while Mason walked beside Victoria through Building A's ground floor, his boots crunching on the temporary plywood sheeting they'd laid over the concrete. "She's going to be an engineer," Mason said. "She's going to be whatever she wants," Victoria said. "But yes, probably an engineer." He stopped near a window that looked out over the courtyard. Still a construction zone, rebar and concrete forms, but the shape of it visible now, the way a face is visible before it's fully finished. "What's that going to be?" he asked, nodding toward the open space. "Community courtyard. Fully accessible pathways, raised garden beds at chair height, seating designed for people with different mobility needs." She looked at it. "And a playground. Lily helped design the playground." Mason turned to look at her. "What?" "I sent her a questionnaire 6 weeks ago. Priya helped me put it together. Things like, what's wrong with most playgrounds? What would you change? What do you wish was different?" She sent back 4 pages. Victoria paused. "Some of it we couldn't implement for structural reasons, but the climbing structure in the corner is going to have an accessible entrance ramp on 2 sides because of something she said about how playgrounds always make one thing harder to get to." Mason was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the courtyard and then back at her. "You didn't tell me you did that." "I didn't want to make a thing of it." "Victoria." "It was a practical decision," she said. "She had useful input." He shook his head slowly. There was an expression on his face that she'd learned to recognize over the past few months. Something that was partly exasperation and partly something else entirely, something that sat behind his eyes, and that he didn't always say out loud. He said things out loud more than most people she knew, but not everything. "Can I tell her?" he asked. "I assumed you would." She moved toward the next section of the building. "She's going to want to see the structure when it's built." "She's going to lose her mind," Mason said, which was, she'd learned, his highest form of praise. They found Lily near the far end of the building, crouched down to examine something at floor level, a threshold detail, the point where the interior floor met an exterior doorway, designed to be completely flat, no lip, no edge that would catch a wheel or a walker, or the toe of someone who dragged their feet when they walked. Bertrand was crouching beside her, explaining how the drainage was handled at the transition. "There's no bump," Lily said. "That's the whole point," Bertrand said. Lily stood up and looked at the doorway with the focused expression of someone filing information away. Then she looked at Victoria. "Is this what you meant? When you said everything works right?" "You said that," Victoria reminded her. "I just agreed with you." Lily considered this with appropriate gravity. "I think I should come back when it's finished." "You will," Victoria said. "I promise." The thing she didn't tell Mason about, the thing she carried through January and February mostly by herself, was Warren. Warren hadn't been finished. Audra had told her he wouldn't be, and he wasn't. The second angle arrived in February, quieter than the first, almost polite. A formal request from Warren and 2 other board members for an independent review of Hale Properties' governance structure, specifically as it related to executive accountability. The language was neutral. The intent was not. An independent review, if it went in a particular direction, could produce recommendations that restructured Victoria's authority, added oversight layers, created reporting requirements, reduced the autonomy of the CEO position in ways that could be implemented without removing her. It was a longer game than the first attempt. More patient. Warren had recalibrated after Thursday's vote and concluded that a direct confrontation wasn't going to work, and he'd chosen something that could be threaded through procedural channels instead. Victoria read the request on a Wednesday morning and sat with it for 1 day before deciding how to respond. The sitting with it was important. She'd learned that from the accident, actually, from the period when every decision had felt urgent, and she'd had to teach herself that urgency was often a feeling rather than a fact, and that the decisions she'd made from that feeling were not always her best ones. On Thursday, she called Audra. "He's not going to stop," Audra said, when Victoria had walked her through it. "I know. The governance review. If he gets the right independent firm." "He's already talked to one," Victoria said. "The firm's called Meridian Group. They did a review for National Capital Partners in 2019. Warren was on that board, too." She paused. The review produced a recommendation to restructure the CEO's reporting relationship. The CEO left 8 months later. Audra was silent for a moment. "You did your homework." "I always do my homework. What do you want to do?" Victoria had thought about this for 24 hours. She'd thought about the Millhaven financing, closed now, the timeline recovered, the project on track for a June completion that would land exactly where she'd told the board it would. She'd thought about Derek Paulson's legal situation, which was proceeding through proper channels and which had the effect of making it very clear to anyone inside the company who might be considering a similar arrangement that the documentation trail would find them eventually. She'd thought about the 7-2 confidence vote, and Franklin Cross, and Gerald Ostroff saying the fundamentals are sound. "I'm going to get ahead of it," she said. "I'm going to propose a governance review myself, before Warren's request reaches a formal vote." Audra went quiet again, which meant she was thinking hard. "If you propose it, I control the scope and the selection of the independent firm. Warren can fight the selection, but fighting a review proposed by the CEO is harder than proposing one himself." Victoria moved to her window. The February lake was iron-colored and brutally still, and the review, if I've chosen the firm correctly, will produce recommendations that strengthen the executive structure rather than constrain it. There's enough in the Derek Paulson situation to justify recommendations about internal information security and unauthorized board communications. Those recommendations land on Warren's side of the table, not mine. Audra was quiet for 3 seconds. "That's a gutsy move." "It's the right move," Victoria said. "Gutsy doesn't come into it." She proposed the governance review at the February board meeting. Warren, presented with a motion he'd intended to introduce himself, did not oppose it. Opposing it would have required him to argue against something he'd privately wanted, which would have raised questions he couldn't comfortably answer. He abstained from the vote. Everyone else voted yes. Victoria selected the independent firm herself. The review began in March. She told Mason about it on a Sunday in late February, sitting in his kitchen while Lily was at a birthday party 2 streets over. He'd made coffee, and they were at the table with a Sunday paper neither of them had read, and she walked him through the board situation in the same way she'd walked him through things before, not sparing the details, not performing composure, just telling him what had happened and how she'd handled it. He listened the way he listened, which was completely. When she finished, he said, "So Warren tried to outmaneuver you, and you outmaneuvered him first." "More or less." "Is he going to try again?" "Probably. He's patient, and he has a long memory." She held her coffee mug. "I might be fighting this particular battle for the next 5 years. Can you do that?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes, I'm better at it than he is." She paused. "That sounds arrogant." "It sounds accurate," Mason said. "There's a difference." She looked at him across the table. He was in his usual Sunday configuration, jeans, a Henley that had been washed enough times that the color had gone soft, 2 days of growth on his jaw. He had an elbow on the table and his chin resting on his hand, and he was looking at her with the directness he'd had since the first day at Birchwood, the quality of someone who paid attention to the person in front of them rather than to their own reaction to that person. "You don't find any of this, I don't know," she said, "exhausting to hear about." "Do you find it exhausting to talk about?" "Sometimes." "Then tell me when you're tired of it, and we'll talk about something else." He lifted his coffee. "But no, I don't find it exhausting. You're good at what you do. It's interesting. It's corporate maneuvering. It's a person figuring out how to protect something worth protecting," he said. "That's interesting to me regardless of what the context is." She looked at her own coffee for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the February morning was pale and cold and very quiet, the kind of Sunday quiet that existed mostly in residential neighborhoods, in houses where people had nowhere they absolutely had to be. "Mason," she said. "Yeah." She'd been trying to find the entry point to this conversation for 3 weeks, and she hadn't found a clean one, so she just went in. "I've been thinking about what this is, what we are, and I keep running into the fact that I don't have good language for it. Not because I don't know what I want, well, I think I know what I want, but because what I want is complicated by a lot of things, and I'm not always sure which complications are real and which ones I'm manufacturing." He set his coffee down. He didn't rush toward her or away from her. He just waited. "I don't have good history with this," she said. "The relationship part. Before the accident, I was too focused on work. After the accident, I was—" She stopped. "It changes things. Being in a wheelchair changes things in ways that are hard to explain unless you've lived it. The way people see you, the way intimacy works, the practical logistics of—" She stopped again. "I'm not making a very coherent point." "You're making a perfectly coherent point," Mason said quietly. "You're telling me you're scared." She looked at him. "I'm telling you it's complicated." "Those two things can both be true," he said, which was what she'd said to him at Birchwood in a different context, and the echo of it landed somewhere. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not afraid of the same things," Mason said. "Claire's been gone almost 2 years. I've been—" He chose his words. "I've been okay. Lily, and the shop, and my mother, that's been enough. But you're not the same as okay. You're something different from okay." He looked at her directly. "And I don't know how to do this perfectly. I'm probably going to get things wrong, but I'd like to keep trying if you would." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee, and the Sunday quiet outside was doing what it did. "I'm not asking for perfect," she said. "Good," he said, "because you're not getting it." She almost smiled. "Neither are you." "Noted." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, not with any ceremony, just for a second before pulling it back. "So we're doing this." "We're doing this," she said. Wham. Spring arrived late that year, which was typical of Chicago. April behaved like February for 3 weeks before relenting into something resembling warmth in the final days of the month. The Millhaven site came alive with it. The landscaping crews moved in behind the finishing construction teams, and the courtyard began to take shape out of what had been rebar and concrete forms, and the playground structure went up over 4 days in early May, while Victoria watched from a folding chair that Bertrand had set up for her without being asked, a detail she appreciated. The climbing structure had 2 accessible entrance ramps, one on each side, just as Lily had suggested. Mason came to see it on the second Saturday in May. He stood in the courtyard in the afternoon light and looked at the playground and the raised garden beds, and the wide, smooth pathways that curved between buildings without a single gratuitous lip or edge, and he was quiet for a long time. "It's real," he said finally. "It's been real," Victoria said. "I just couldn't show you yet." "No, I know. I just mean—" He gestured, not with any precision, just outward, at the whole of it. "When you talk about a project, it's a project. When you see it, it's a place where people are going to live." "That's the whole point," she said. He looked at the playground again. "She's going to lose her mind." "You said that in February." "I say it when it's true." He turned to face her. "Can I show her this weekend? She's been asking every week. Tell Bertrand he'll arrange it." He nodded. Then he looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, that thing that sat behind his eyes. And this time, he didn't leave it there. "I want to say something," he said. "Okay. I know this project is yours. I know you built it and fought for it, and I was on the edge of it, watching." "You were not on the edge of it," Victoria said. "Let me finish." He was choosing his words carefully, the way he did when he meant them. "I was watching, and I want you to know that the way you held on to it, when the board and the article and all of it, you didn't let them take it from you, not because you were stubborn or because of pride, but because you knew it was worth protecting." He stopped. "I don't know how to say this without sounding like a greeting card." "You're not sounding like a greeting card," she said. I'm proud of you," he said. "I know that might be a strange thing for me to say, but I am." She looked at him. The May light was doing something to the courtyard, picking up the pale concrete and the new planted grass and the wood of the playground structure, and around them the buildings of Millhaven stood mostly finished and very quiet, waiting for the people who were going to come and live their lives inside them. "It's not a strange thing," she said. He held her look. Then he said quietly, "I love you, Victoria." She hadn't been ready for it exactly. She'd known it was coming, had felt the shape of it building over weeks. But the actual words, said plainly, without preamble, in the middle of an unfinished courtyard on a Saturday in May, arrived with their own specific weight. She let the weight of them sit for a moment. "I know," she said. And then, "I love you too." He nodded once, slowly, like something had been confirmed that he'd needed confirmed. He didn't make a production of it. She appreciated that more than she could easily explain. A bird landed on the edge of one of the raised garden beds and looked at them for a moment before flying off again, and the afternoon continued around them, ordinary and irreplaceable. 2 weeks before the June opening, Mason came to the site with a concern. He'd been over 3 times by then, twice with Lily, once on his own at Victoria's invitation when she'd needed an outside eye on something she couldn't quite name, and he knew the project well enough that his concern was specific rather than general, which was the kind of concern worth having. "The main entry path from the parking structure," he said, standing at the south end of the site with his hands in his jacket pockets. "The gradient." Victoria had looked at that grade herself. "It's within ADA spec." "I know it's within spec. I'm saying it's going to be harder than it needs to be for someone in a manual chair. Not impossible, but harder." He paced it out, heel to toe, looking down. 20 feet at this angle, especially if it's icy in winter, I'm thinking about the people who live here who don't have a motor assist. Is there a way to add a break in the grade, a level rest point partway up? She looked at the path. She pulled up the grade specifications on her phone. She walked, drove, the path herself, feeling what 20 feet of sustained slope felt like. And he was right, technically compliant. Actually harder than it needed to be. "Dara's going to be annoyed," she said. "She'll be less annoyed than a resident who struggles with that path every day for 10 years, Mason said. Victoria called Dara. Dara was briefly annoyed. Then she looked at it herself and said, "He's right. We can add a landing at the midpoint. It's going to cost us." She named a figure and a number of days. "Do it," Victoria said. She looked at Mason after she hung up. "You have good instincts." "I fix things for a living," he said. "You get used to looking at what's actually there instead of what's supposed to be there." She thought about Derek Paulson, who had looked at what was there and seen something to dismantle. She thought about Warren, who looked at what was there and saw a threat to manage. She thought about Mason, who looked at a path grade and saw the person who was going to use it every day for 10 years. "You should have been an engineer," she said. "I am an engineer," he said, "just for different things." She started back toward Building A. After a moment, he fell into step beside her. or beside her chair, the easy, unconsidered way he moved with her now, which was the thing she'd stopped noticing and then started noticing again because of how different it was from the careful, performed unobtrusiveness of most people. He just walked beside her. That was all. The landing was added. It cost the project 4 days and a sum of money that was real but not unreasonable. In the final walkthrough before the opening, Victoria stopped at the midpoint of the path and turned her chair and looked back at the parking structure and forward at the main building entrance. And she thought about the people who were going to stand on this landing, or park their chairs on it, or rest their walkers against the railing she'd insisted on, and look at the same view. Bertrand was standing beside her. "The landing work out okay?" he asked. "It worked out exactly right," she said. The opening was scheduled for the second Saturday in June, and it rained. Not a polite drizzle, a real Chicago summer rain, the kind that came in sideways off the lake and turned umbrellas inside out and made the city smell like wet concrete and something older underneath it. Victoria stood at her apartment window at 6 in the morning and watched it come down and felt, briefly, the specific frustration of a person who had spent 3 years building something and now had to do the opening ceremony in a poncho. She called Bertrand at 6:15. "The courtyard drainage is handling it," he said before she could ask. "The pathways are clear, the accessible parking structure is covered. The main ceremony area is under the tent we brought in Thursday." A pause. "It's going to be fine." "It's going to be wet," she said. "It's Chicago in June," Bertrand said. "Everyone knows what they signed up for." She made coffee and looked at her notes for the remarks she was giving at 10 and thought about changing 3 sentences and then decided not to. The remarks were right. They'd been right for 2 weeks. She had a habit of revising things past the point of improvement when she was nervous, which she acknowledged was nerves and not editorial judgment, and she put the notes in her bag and left them alone. Mason called at 7. "Lily wants to know if the rain cancels it," he said. "Tell her no." "I told her no. She wants to hear it from you." There was a shuffling sound and then Lily's voice, still morning rough. "Does the rain cancel it?" "Absolutely not," Victoria said. "Rain means the plants in the courtyard garden are getting watered for free." A pause. "That's a good point," Lily said, with the seriousness of someone genuinely updating their position. "Okay." More shuffling, and Mason was back. "We'll be there by 9:30. "I'll be on site by 8, she said. "There are things to check." "There are always things to check with you," he said. It wasn't a criticism, just a fact, said with the ease of someone who knew a person well enough to observe them accurately. "See you at 9:30, she said. She got to Millhaven at 7:52. The rain had leveled off to a steady drizzle by then, and the site crew was working through their setup list with the focused efficiency of people who had done this before, and were not going to let weather make them look unprepared. The tent over the ceremony area was secure. The chairs were arranged in rows with extra width between them for mobility devices, a detail that had been specified in the event plan and that Victoria checked anyway, because the difference between specified and actual was where problems lived. She drove the main pathway from the parking structure to Building A. The landing, the one Mason had identified, the rest point at the midpoint of the grade, was clear of standing water, the drainage working exactly as Dara's modification had intended. She stood on it for a moment in the drizzle and looked at the courtyard, the garden beds dark and wet, the playground structure with its 2 ramps glistening, the wide paths curving between buildings that were now filled with people who had moved in over the past 3 weeks, the first residents of Millhaven, who had their own specific and irreplaceable reasons for being here. She thought about the day she'd driven past this block of the South Side 3.5 years ago. Boarded windows, a chain-link fence, grass that had given up, and had pulled over and sat in her car and looked at it for 20 minutes. She'd been 4 months out of the hospital. Her physical therapy was 3 days a week. She'd been back at her desk for 5 weeks, making calls from a chair that was going to be permanent in ways she was still getting used to, and she'd been driving somewhere she no longer remembered when she'd seen the block and pulled over. She'd written 4 words in the Notes app on her phone. A place that works. 3.5 years between 4 words and this. A board battle, a leaked document, a planted article, a governance review that had, in the end, produced recommendations that strengthened her position rather than diminished it. Warren had been quiet since March, a silence that wasn't peace, but was, for now, the absence of active hostilities. The Derek Paulson lawsuit had settled in February, quietly, with terms that included a non-disclosure agreement and a figure that Francis had called satisfactory. The Millhaven phase, 2. Financing was committed and would carry the project forward into the second and third residential buildings, scheduled for completion 18 months out. None of it had been clean. None of it had gone the way she'd originally planned it. There had been a period, somewhere in the middle of the board battle, when she'd lain awake in her apartment at 2 in the morning and done the honest calculation of whether she was holding on because the project was worth holding on to, or because she'd confused the project with herself, with her own need to prove something. And she hadn't liked that calculation, and hadn't been able to fully resolve it. She still wasn't sure she'd fully resolved it. What she knew was that on the third week of March, an 81-year-old woman named Estelle Granger had moved into Unit 4B in Building A. Estelle used a walker following a hip replacement 18 months earlier, and she'd been on a waiting list for accessible housing for 2 years before Millhaven became available, and she'd told the intake coordinator that her previous apartment had a bathroom door that was 3 inches too narrow, and she'd been turning sideways to get through it every day for a year and a half. Unit 4B had a bathroom door that was 36 inches wide and a roll-in shower and lever handles on every faucet in the apartment. Victoria knew about Estelle because Bertrand had mentioned her in a site update, casually, as one resident among several who'd moved in during the March intake. She'd asked to see Estelle's intake form. She hadn't done anything with it. It wasn't her place to contact residents directly, but she'd read it twice and put it in a folder she kept in her desk drawer and not discussed it with anyone. Some things you just needed to know were true. She drove back toward the ceremony tent, and the rain continued its steady work on the courtyard, and the morning moved toward 10. The ceremony was not what Victoria would have designed if she'd been designing a ceremony for herself, which was part of why she'd let Priya and the events team handle most of it. There were speeches, the Southside alderman who'd supported the project through 2 city council cycles, a representative from the disability advocacy organization that had consulted on the design, Audra Bell on behalf of the Hale Properties Board, whose presence and whose remarks were both pointed and appropriate, the needle threaded with the skill of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. There was a moment when they unveiled the plaque by the main entrance, which read, Millhaven, designed for everyone, which was the most accurate description of the project that fit in 8 words. Then it was Victoria's turn. She'd given a lot of speeches. She knew what they were supposed to feel like. Prepared, delivered with enough ease to seem unscripted, emotionally present without going so far into the personal that it became self-indulgent. She knew where the line was. She'd been drawing that line for years. She looked out at the tent, the faces, residents, city officials, board members, journalists, people from the advocacy organizations, construction crew members who'd come on their day off. Bertrand standing to one side with his arms folded and his hard hat still on for reasons that were apparently personal. Mason and Lily were 3 rows back. Lily had the focused expression of someone taking this seriously. Mason had his hands in his jacket pockets and was looking at her with the same directness he'd had in a cafe on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 18 months ago. She looked down at her notes for 1 second, then put them in her lap face down. "I wrote something prepared," she said. "I'm going to put it aside." A small shift in the audience. Not restlessness, more like adjustment. People leaning in slightly. 3.5 years ago, I drove past this block, she said. I was 4 months out of the hospital after an accident that had changed my life in ways I was still learning to understand. I pulled over, and I looked at this empty lot, and I wrote 4 words in my phone, a place that works. She paused. I didn't know what that meant yet. I knew it meant something. Rain on the tent roof, a steady sound. People not moving. The accessible housing that exists in most cities is designed around a minimum, around what the law requires. It says to people, you are accommodated. You are included as a category. She stopped. That's not the same as belonging. That's not the same as a place that was built with you in mind from the beginning, not as an afterthought, not as a compliance checkbox, but as a person whose life is real and whose need for a working bathroom door and a path they can manage, and a parking space they can actually use is not an edge case. It is the case. It is the whole point. She looked at the front row, where Estelle Granger was sitting in a chair beside her walker. She'd introduced herself to Estelle an hour earlier, before the ceremony, and Estelle had said, I heard a lot about this project before I moved in. I thought maybe it would be oversold. And then she'd looked around her apartment and said, it wasn't oversold. Those 3 words had cost Victoria more composure than anything Warren Chu had ever done. I want to say something to the people who live here, Victoria said. You didn't get this because someone was generous. You got it because you were owed it, Because everyone is owed a home that works for the life they're actually living, not the life that's easiest to design for. She waited a second. And I want to say something to everyone else here. This is not a charity. This is not a special program. This is what housing can be if we decide that's what we're building. She looked at her notes, still face down in her lap. I had a lot of help, more than I can name. But there's an 8-year-old girl in the third row who once described this project better than I ever have. So I'm going to give her the last word. She looked at Lily. Lily went very still, which was the stillness of a child who has not been warned that this is coming. She said, "It's a neighborhood where everything works right." Victoria let that sit. That's what we built. Thank you for being here to see it. The applause started, and she let it happen and looked out at the faces and did not look anywhere in particular for a specific number of seconds until she had her composure back, which took longer than it usually did in public settings, and which she decided she was going to allow. Lily cried a little, which she denied immediately, and then admitted too when pressed. I didn't know you were going to say that, she told Victoria, outside the tent after the ceremony, the drizzle having lightened to almost nothing. Her hard hat was back on. I know, Victoria said. Sorry. Don't be sorry. Lily wiped her face with her sleeve with the efficiency of someone who wanted that resolved quickly. It was good. It was the right thing to say. She straightened. Can I go see the playground? Go, Victoria said. She watched Lily run toward the courtyard, hard hat slightly askew, and she was aware of Mason coming to stand beside her without looking. She's going to tell this story for the rest of her life, he said. Good, Victoria said. She should. Around them, the ceremony was dissolving into the easier thing that came after ceremonies. People talking, moving through the site, the journalists taking their photos, the residents filtering back toward their buildings. The rain had mostly stopped, and a thin June sun was making a tentative appearance through the clouds, in the way of someone not entirely sure of their welcome. Audra found her at some point in the middle of it, touching her arm briefly, saying, Well done. Warren was here, by the way. He came. Victoria looked up. He left after your remarks. But he came. I know, Victoria said. She'd seen him arrive. She'd watched him during the speech, watched him watching her, and what she'd seen on his face was something she'd tried to read and mostly couldn't, except that it was not what she'd expected, which was dismissal. It was more complicated than that, and she didn't have the information to interpret it, and she let it go. Audra squeezed her arm once and moved on, and Victoria sat in the clearing day and let the morning be what it was. The thing about building something, Victoria had learned, was that you could not fully see it while you were building it. You were too close, too aware of every problem and compromise and near failure, too fluent in what it had cost. The scene happened later, when you were standing in the finished thing and other people were living their lives inside it, and the distance gave you back the original idea in its simplest form. She understood Millhaven differently after the opening than she had before it. Not better. She'd understood it deeply before, had lived inside its complications for 3 years, but differently, more completely. The way you understand a decision you've made, not in the moment you make it, but in the months after, when you've seen what it turned into. She thought about this on a Sunday evening in July, sitting in the courtyard of Millhaven. She visited twice a month now, formally, as part of a resident feedback program she'd set up with Priya, watching a group of kids move through the playground, 3 of them using the ground-level accessible entrance. One small boy on a bright red scooter making use of the landing paths. 2 other children who had no specific mobility need and were using the ramps because the ramps were there. And interesting, which was the point of designing something well. It becomes the obvious thing, not the special accommodation. Estelle Granger was in the courtyard garden. She came out every Sunday afternoon, Bertrand had told her. She was growing tomatoes in one of the raised beds. Victoria wheeled over. How are the tomatoes? She asked. Estelle looked up. She had the unhurried quality of someone who had decided, at 81, not to rush anything that didn't require rushing. Slow, she said. Tomatoes are always slow. That's why people give up on them. She looked at Victoria. You don't give up on slow things. No, Victoria said. I can tell. Estelle looked back at her plants. My daughter came to visit last week. She walked through the whole place. She kept saying, I don't understand why everywhere isn't like this. She paused. I didn't know what to tell her. You could tell her it's a choice, Victoria said. Everything about design is a choice. Some people just choose differently. Estelle considered this. I'd have been angrier if I was younger, she said, knowing it was a choice all along. I'm still angry, Victoria said. I just try to build something instead of just being angry. Estelle made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. She went back to her tomatoes. Victoria sat with her for another few minutes without talking, and the courtyard moved around them, and the July evening came in warm and long, and the city beyond the buildings went about its enormous business. The proposal happened in September, and it was nothing like what Victoria would have written if she'd been writing it. She would have written something at a restaurant, probably. Good lighting, a moment that felt curated. She would have written something intentional and dignified. She understood by September that Mason didn't work that way, which was one of the things she'd learned about him, and which she had come to understand as a feature rather than a limitation. They were in his kitchen. This was where half the significant things in their relationship had happened, which she suspected said something about how real life actually organized itself, in ordinary rooms rather than orchestrated ones. Lily was asleep. It was a Sunday evening in mid-September, dishes still on the table from dinner, a half-empty bottle of wine between them, too. Mason had been quiet for a few minutes, which was the specific quality of quiet that meant he was working toward something. She was waiting. She would have denied this if asked, waiting for a while. I have something to ask you, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know? I've known for about 3 weeks. She held her wine glass. I've been waiting for you to get there. He stared at her for a moment. You could have said something. It wasn't mine to say. He let out a breath that was partly frustration and partly a laugh. I've been trying to figure out the right moment for weeks. This is the right moment, she said. The dishes are still on the table and Lily's asleep and we're in your kitchen. This is exactly the right moment. He looked at her steadily. Then he reached into the pocket of his jeans. She'd always wonder later how long it had been in that pocket, whether he'd carried it for days, and set a ring on the table between them. It wasn't a large ring. It was a simple band with a single stone, something chosen with the same lack of performance that had characterized everything he'd done since the first afternoon at Birchwood, and it was, she thought, completely right. I'm not going to do the whole speech, he said. You know how I feel. You've known for a while. I have, she agreed. Lily knows I'm asking, he said. She's the one who reminded me not to wait too long, which was a slightly uncomfortable conversation to have with a 9-year-old. He looked at the ring on the table. I want to build something with you. I know you already build things on a scale I can't keep up with. But I mean, he stopped. I mean the smaller version, the daily version. She looked at him. She thought about this first morning she'd woken up in this house, 8 months ago, having stayed too late and fallen asleep on the couch, while they were watching something and had heard Lily in the kitchen making toast before school and Mason telling her quietly not to wake Victoria, and had lain there on the couch and listened to the morning sounds of a household operating, belonging to itself, and had felt something she hadn't had a name for then and had a name for now. Yes, she said. He picked up the ring. She held out her hand. He put it on and it fit, which was another thing she'd wonder about later. Whether he'd figured it out somehow, guessed the size, and she'd eventually ask and he'd tell her that his mother had told him, because his mother had noticed the ring Victoria wore on her right hand and had an eye for measurements. And the casual practicality of that would make her laugh for a long time. He held her hand for a moment after, not with ceremony, just the way you held something you were glad to have in your hands. Lily's going to wake up early tomorrow, he said. I know. She looked at the ring. She's going to have opinions about this. She's going to have a lot of opinions about this. Good, Victoria said. She should. Say, they married in March. Not the following March. The one after that. Which gave Lily time to plan things with the thoroughness that she brought to all planning, and gave Victoria time to complete Millhaven Phase 2's groundbreaking, and gave Mason time to buy out Dale's half of the shop with a business loan and a plan that he'd worked on for 6 months, which meant that the auto shop that had been Dale's shop was now, as of January, only Mason's shop, which he renamed simply Brooks Auto, which was a name that lacked imagination and which he was completely at peace with. The wedding was small, which was what both of them wanted, and which Lily had complicated slightly by inviting 9 people without consulting either of them. The guests included Audra Bell, who had become in the course of the Millhaven fight something closer to a friend than a board member, though the distinction remained professionally intact. Frances Park, who came alone and drank exactly 1 glass of champagne and gave a toast that was 3 sentences long and extremely precise. Bertrand, who cried openly and without embarrassment and whom nobody teased about it. Mason's mother, who had met Victoria 4 times, and on each occasion had said very little, but had communicated approval through a series of small physical gestures. A hand on the shoulder, a cup of tea produced without being asked, that Victoria had understood and was grateful for. Several people from Mason's life she'd come to know over the course of a year and a half. Dale, who'd sold his share of the shop and was now doing something in Phoenix and had driven back for the weekend. 2 friends from Mason's Evanston years who had the ease of people who'd known each other a long time and were mostly at peace with everything. And Priya, who was 28 now and had been promoted to chief of staff 6 months earlier and had cried when told and had denied it and had never denied anything with less conviction. Lily was the one who made them exchange the rings because she had declared herself the ring bearer and had taken this role with the gravity it apparently deserved. The ceremony was outside, on a day that was cold but clear. The March sky, that particular shade of blue that only existed in transition seasons, too clean to be winter and not yet soft enough to be spring. Victoria wore a dress that was practical. She'd had one fitting before she found the one that looked right and worked with her chair and didn't create the problems that formal dresses often created. And when she found it, she bought it the same day without deliberating further. She'd spent enough of her life deliberating over things that required action, and she'd gotten better at knowing the difference. She looked at Mason when they got to the part that mattered, and he looked back, and there was nothing performed about either of them, which was the thing she'd have wanted most if she'd been writing it. After, a dinner at a restaurant that seated 14, which was exactly the right size. Lily sat next to Victoria, and at some point during the appetizers reached over and put her small hand on Victoria's arm in a gesture that was not theatrical, not designed, just the motion of a child who wanted to be close to the person next to her. Victoria put her hand over Lily's, and they stayed that way through the bread course. Mason caught her eye across the table. She gave him nothing, expression-wise. He knew what she meant anyway. That night, after the restaurant, after Lily had fallen asleep in the car and Mason had carried her inside and come back downstairs, they sat in the kitchen, where else? And the house was quiet, in the way it was quiet at the end of something that had taken a long time to get to. Victoria had been thinking about Renata. She hadn't spoken to Renata since Birchwood. She'd heard, through the specific information channels of a city that was smaller than it looked, that Renata had been embarrassed by the whole thing, that when the video had not produced the outcome intended, when it had instead produced a minor media moment about a CEO handling cruelty with composure, several of Renata's social connections had quietly distanced themselves. She'd moved to Portland the previous year, someone had mentioned, and Victoria had heard this and felt nothing in particular, which told her that she had processed what needed processing and let the rest go. She didn't think about Renata with anger anymore. She'd been angry for a while, not loudly, but steadily, the kind of anger that runs under everything and takes energy to maintain even when you're not aware you're maintaining it. It had faded not because she'd decided to let it go, but because it had gradually become less interesting than everything else. What Renata had intended as humiliation had instead produced a Tuesday afternoon in October, which had produced a man carrying daisies, which had produced 8 months of carefully finding out whether something was real, which had produced everything since. She didn't feel grateful to Renata. That would have been too neat. But she did think sometimes about the strange geometry of it, the way that cruelty, failing at its purpose, had created an opening. She'd mentioned this once to Mason, and he'd thought about it and said, "I don't think I'd put it that way. I think what happened is that we both ended up in the same cafe, and we're both people who don't run from difficult situations." He paused. Renata just happened to be the reason we were there. It was a better framing. She'd kept it. "What are you thinking about?" Mason said. They were at the table with wine. Neither of them was drinking, and the kitchen the way she'd come to know it. Warm, a little cluttered at the edges, Lily's latest project on the counter, a drawing of a building she'd decided she was going to design someday. "The cafe," Victoria said. He nodded slowly, like this made sense. "The daisies. Among other things." She looked at him. "Do you know what I was thinking on the drive over, before I went in?" "Tell me." "I was thinking that I was going to be polite for an hour and then go home." She paused. "I'd already decided it wasn't going to be anything." "I know," he said. "I could tell when I walked in." She raised an eyebrow. "Could you?" "You had the look of someone who was already managing their exit." He picked up his wine. "I thought, okay, this is going to be one of those. And then you said something I don't remember exactly, and I thought, maybe not." "What did I say?" He thought about it. You agreed that nobody actually likes roses. He almost smiled. It was the specificity of it, like you'd thought about it before. She had thought about it before. She had an entire history with roses that she'd never explained to anyone. A series of obligatory bouquets received over years from people who were going through the motions of something. The flowers dying in glasses of water in a series of hotel rooms and apartments, and the occasional corner of a hospital room. She'd thought about it, and she'd said so, and apparently that had been enough. 18 months. The Millhaven opening. A board she'd held. A company she'd protected. A governance review that had, in the end, recommended ethics training for board members regarding unauthorized external communications. A recommendation that had been addressed with crisp specificity to Warren Chu and his documented contact with Derek Paulson, and which Warren had accepted in the specific way of a man choosing his battles. He remained on the board. He was cordial. He would always be waiting for an angle, and she would always be watching for it, and that was the relationship they had, and she'd made her peace with it. She looked around the kitchen. Lily's building drawing, a coffee mug that Mason had been meaning to replace for 6 months, a small piece of paper on the refrigerator that said, in Lily's handwriting, grocery, milk, eggs, the good kind of crackers, not the boring ones. The daisies she'd asked Mason to buy last week were in a proper vase now. She owned one, had bought one, which had seemed like a small thing and had felt like a larger one. Mason, she said. Yeah, I want to ask you something. She looked at him. Do you ever think about the version where we don't stay? Where I leave Birchwood after figuring out what it was? He considered it. Sometimes. Do you? Sometimes. She turned her wine glass. I don't think I would have stayed if you'd reacted differently. If you'd been angry, or performed being above it, or wanted to make a thing of confronting Renata. What did you need me to do? Exactly what you did, she said. Just stay. He was quiet for a moment. Is that what you needed, or what you were testing for? It was a good question. She thought about it honestly. Maybe both, she said. After the accident, I spent a long time building things I could control. The company, the project, my own recovery, in the sense that I could manage and push and force outcomes. People don't work like that. You can't build someone into being trustworthy. She paused. I'd stopped trying. I'd kind of given up on the idea that I'd find out. And then a man walked into a cafe carrying daisies and didn't hesitate, she said, and stayed for an extra 2 hours, even when he didn't have to. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm and the house was quiet, and outside the March night was cold in the particular way of Chicago in the last weeks before it finally gave in to spring. I want to say something, he said, and it might sound like a summary of everything, which I know you find reductive. Say it anyway. I think... He stopped and started again, which he didn't do often. I think the two things that made this work are so simple that they're almost embarrassing. I saw you, and you let me. He paused. Everything else was just time and showing up. She thought about that. She thought about 3.5 years ago, a woman in a car outside an empty lot, writing 4 words in a notes app, a place that works. She'd thought she was writing about a housing project. Maybe she had been. Maybe she'd also been writing about something else, something she hadn't known yet how to want, something she'd been too careful to reach toward. She'd reach toward it anyway, not gracefully, not without hesitation, not without the 1,000 calculations she made before letting anything in. But eventually she'd let herself be seen by someone who had the patience for what that took, and she'd been seen, and it had held. That was the thing she'd carry. Not the board vote, not the Millhaven opening, not the press coverage that had come after, and the national recognition, and the speaking invitation she'd accepted, and the ones she'd turned down, not the governance review or Derek Paulson's settlement or Warren's careful cordiality at the board meeting in April. Those things mattered. She'd fought for all of them. She was proud of the fight. But the thing that had changed her, not the accident, which had broken and rebuilt her in ways she was still understanding, but the thing that had changed the particular quality of what her life was smaller than all of that. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and a man who didn't hesitate and daisies that were already slightly wilted before they made it through the door. She'd put them in water. They'd lasted 5 days, which was longer than she'd expected. She'd thrown them out when they were finished, which was the right thing to do, and she hadn't been sentimental about it, which was the honest thing to do, and she'd thought about them for weeks after, which was the true thing. You're right, she said. It's embarrassing how simple it is. Most true things are, Mason said. She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who fixed things for a living and had a daughter who was going to design buildings and had carried daisies into a cafe on a Tuesday in October because he'd thought, correctly, that nobody actually liked roses. Outside, the city was doing its enormous and indifferent thing, all that light and motion and accumulated human weight pressing outward in every direction. She was part of it, had always been part of it, even in the years when she'd felt most separate from everything. And she was also here, in this kitchen, in this house, with these people, which was a different and specific thing, and she held both at once the way she'd learned to hold most things, without pretending they were simpler than they were, and without making them harder than they needed to be. That was the other thing she'd carry, that you could build a life out of what remained after the worst thing happened to you, and the life you built could be real and full and genuinely yours, and it didn't require being finished with the worst thing. It didn't require healing into some complete and unblemished version of yourself. It required showing up in the kitchen on a Sunday night and being honest about what you saw, and letting someone else do the same. She'd learned that from a man who ate lunch in a closet with his grieving daughter for 2 weeks, because the alternative was fighting with her. She'd learned it from an 8-year-old who looked at a housing project and said it was a neighborhood where everything works right, which was the truest description Victoria had ever heard of what she was trying to do, in every sense she'd come to understand. She picked up her wine. Mason picked up his. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The March night pressed against the windows, and the house held them, and somewhere upstairs Lily was asleep in a room with planets on the walls, dreaming whatever a 9-year-old dreamed when she was safe and warm, and knew, without having to check, that the people she loved were downstairs. That was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. And Victoria Hale, who had spent most of her life building things, understood for the first time what it felt like to already be standing inside the thing she'd been building toward. She didn't name it. Some things didn't need names. She just stayed.